Good evening, I'm Richard Beeston, I work at the Times, and we're here this evening to hear Henry Hemming's account of his fantastic trip around the Middle East, which coincided with the build-up and the execution and the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, a particularly interesting time. And he brings a very different take on it to, I think, any of you who've been here before for other discussions on the Middle East will be used to the usual diet of politics, which after half an hour sends most people to sleep. I can assure you that won't be the case tonight, because this is a strangely apolitical book. It's really a travel log by someone who's an artist, who's traveling with artists, who's going by road, and who's going through all the difficult countries of the region, including Iraq, before and after the war. And it's his exploits, obviously, and his adventures, but also, I think, something more pertinent than that. As we look at the disaster that is the modern Middle East, and we're forced to confront the notion that there's a clash of civilization, I think what Henry and his traveling companions found was a great humanity in the region and a lot of common shared values. So hopefully we're going to be able to explore some of those ideas today. We're often told that there's a clash of civilizations between our society and Muslim culture. And, what did you encounter on your year at the wheel of Yasmine, his hardy pickup truck?
Well, I didn't encounter a clash of civilizations, I know that. And I think it was, in a way, important to go into the year, into the journey, with that as a background, and having that in the back of my mind as something to be shot down, if indeed it was there to be shot down. I think most of the reason why I wrote this book was I found something very, very different. I found complexity, which of course you'd expect to find because it's such a broad statement. Anyone who entertains the idea of there being such a thing as a clash of civilizations, the myth of confrontation. So that part was actually quite easy, having that thrown out of the window fairly early on. I suppose what was more difficult was working out exactly what that complexity was, what made the countries different, what constituted the different identities from place to place. And I mean that both within countries as well as within the entire region.
Now, one of the places you spent a lot of time in initially was Iran, and I think I should explain to the audience that he funded his trip by painting and then having exhibitions and selling his artwork locally, which led to some amusing deadlines with no pictures painted and a full gallery and whatnot. But you seem to, I'm maybe reading too much into it, you seem to really like Iran, possibly the most of all the countries you went to. How did you find Iran? Because the portrayal we see often here is, you know, a fairly caricatured portrayal of rabid people saying death to Britain. And what did you find when you went there?
Well, it's certainly the warmest, and I don't mean temperature, but in terms of the people I met, it's the warmest country I've ever been to. I've never felt so safe. I'm trying to think of an interesting way of saying that without it sounding as though I've been brainwashed or without it sounding too saccharine. I found that, especially as someone making art outside, the level of, I don't say the level of critique, that sounds much too high up, but the way people would respond to me being outside in any given street making art was unlike any other country I've been to. The number of people who would come and sit behind me patiently, watch, talk to me, come and bring me cups of tea, food, lots of food actually, and lots of tea. And this was, because most of the time I was there was during Ramadan, or Ramazan in Persian, and that added another level to it, because what happens in the last 2-3 hours of most days, a lot of guys don't want to be working. They want something to distract them. And quite often me or Al or any of the people we were working with would provide that distraction. So we, and it really was, it was unique to any other country I've made art in the way people were so responsive to this sort of strange-looking person sitting in their midst making a painting.
How did they respond to you? You had an exhibition there, I think.
Yeah.
How did that go down? I mean, what sort of people came to?
It was a mixture, like any exhibition. It was a smattering of foreign journalists and diplomats based in Tehran. But also there's, I suppose, the majority of the people who came were art students, because there's a really thriving art college system in Iran, and thousands upon thousands of people who go to study art. mostly female as well. There's quite a sort of gender bias, the idea that to be a man and to be an artist, or to study art, is relatively rare. But no, we had, I think it was the most critically interesting response to our work that we had anywhere in the region was what came out of that exhibition. And it was the fact that people would come along to see the work and feel comfortable about tearing it apart and telling you when you've got it really wrong.
Oh, so they weren't just fawning, you're a Western artist,
No.
you must be fantastic.
And I think most self-respecting artists loathe that. Without sounding too sadomasochistic, but you crave that. You want to know where you're going wrong. You want to know where you can take whatever it is you're making forward. And we've got a lot of that. I'll stop. They're after me. So yeah, that was of all the places we went to, that was the most interesting and the most warm response to the work we're making.
Now, it was interesting reading the passage when the war drums were finally loudest, and the build-up and the actual invasion of Iraq, because I think you were in Jordan then, living amongst ordinary Jordanians near Petra, I think.
Absolutely,
yeah. How did that feel to be someone who's British, who probably, has many of the same emotions we have about seeing soldiers go to battle, whatever, and yet watching it on Al Jazeera with everyone hoping that the Americans and the British are going to be killed and beaten? And what was that experience like?
It was just as confusing as you'd imagine. And I suppose on top of that was the fact that a lot of the people we knew in the region or in Jordan were saying, go home. There are enough people who were saying, stay where you are. So I think the hardest thing was trying to reassess every single day at what point we were going to be in danger. Because I think when you look back on it, it's quite easy to forget that the feeling just before the war began of there being no one really knowing the limit to the level of reaction that was going to be unleashed. There were lots of articles, if you go back, I've done it, if you trawl through articles written in the weeks leading up to the war, lots of people talk about the Arab street rising up and so on, this mythical term, the Arab street. And it was a lot more scary in prospect than in reality. But I think it's very easy to forget that. The moment the war began, everyone saw that there was not this seismic reaction that some people projected.
You weren't threatened personally, or?
No. I've described in the book there was one time when some middle-class students in a cafe yelled jihad or son of a bitch, but in a very limp way, if I can say it like that. And about as far away as I am from the wall to me, but not so even shaking a fist, just jihad.
Now, you very carefully skirted around whether you thought the war was a good idea or a bad idea, and you arrive in Baghdad. The regime has been overthrown just a few weeks before, sort of usual scenes of chaos and looting and stuff. But you managed to hook into the art world in Baghdad, which was then still flourishing. And tell me, what did you encounter when you...
The Baghdad
art scene, and what was the Baghdad art scene like?
It was fascinating. I mean, it had gone through, as I described in the book, it had gone through an incredible renaissance. It had become really fashionable in the years leading up to that, especially after the Oil for Food program began. It had become fashionable for Iraqi high society to turn up at art dues and to start patronizing artists. And there was a phenomenal number of new galleries that appeared. But when we arrived, everyone was in a state of flux, because suddenly no one was buying work anymore. And that, of course, for an artist is terrifying, when you don't know whether the people who are buying your work have left the country, if they're dead, or a lot of the people who are buying work were part of the UN. So they, of course, all left after Sergio, I forget his name, was killed in that explosion. Yeah, exactly. So there was uncertainty, but at the same time, fused with that was a huge excitement at the possibility of what they're about to make. And I think there still is, in terms of what you can make. But, as again, any artist will tell you, you've got to sell work. It's a bit depressing making fantastic work, but no one's buying it, or there's no one there to buy it.
Have you found it difficult since you come back to... I mean, it must have been very inspirational to be travelling and working and meeting with people and painting or producing sculptures. Is it difficult when you're in a slightly more, mundane environment like modern Britain to be inspired in the same way? Or?
No, not at all. And I very much came to the end of a particular, I realized the limits to what I could actually make in terms of art in the Middle East as an outsider. I became much more aware of the fact that I was coming to it as someone from Britain, a Westerner. And I think when I started, I thought I could escape that. And I was probably mistaken in that. That was in the back of my mind. I thought it was something I could do. I very much wanted to make the same kind of work I'd make in London. So the moment I realized that wasn't possible, it no longer became so attractive to be making work in the Middle East, or even worse, sitting in a studio in London, churning out the same work, regurgitating a memory, which becomes further away with every day that passes.
Right.
So more blurred and more tied into your fantasy or your mythology or what you want it to be.
Just out of personal curiosity, what happened to the central character in the book, which is your car, Yasmine? Because you don't make it clear in the book what happened to her, and
I know.
you have obviously a very strong attachment to the car.
I do. There should be an epilogue. It's a sad story. Oh, I don't know if it's a story, but no, what's happened to her is sad. She ended up in a field in Gloucestershire, my parents' house, and she was very happy there for about 8 months. And then she was broken into, and two boys spent, I think, between 20 minutes and 30 minutes with a Stanley knife, really carefully ripping every single bit of the upholstery, and pulling out both the handles and the ignition, and she's in just in a really bad way.
So she survived a year in the Middle East and was vandalized in England.
No one wanted to. Well, as you read, I mean, there were some Lebanese army officers who wanted to destroy
to blow her up, yeah, that's
yes.
right.
But other than that, nobody wanted to destroy her.
Well, on that note, maybe we could take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there are many questions out here. And the only thing I'll say beforehand is, often when we have talks on the Middle East, people stand up and they start giving speeches about what they think about the war in Iraq. So we're really here to hear Henry. So if we can keep it to questions and fairly curt, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much.
My question is actually about process. When you set out on this journey, did you think that you were going to write a book?
I had it in the back of my mind. I didn't think I would, because I'd never written anything before that was worthy of being published, so this was not the agenda. The agenda was to make a body of work, body of art, that is. But I kept copious diaries.
So you did it through journaling, not retrospectively?
I did,
so
yeah.
So you edited the journals into the book?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Just can I follow something up? What happened to that art? I mean, I know you sold some of it to pay for petrol and food and stuff, but did you keep a body of work still, or has it been sold off?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge body of work, and a lot of it has found homes. They've fled the nest, but there's still a few loitering, if I can. I don't want to personify them too much, but I know I end up doing that. But I guess the best record of it is the book that we had come out, the visual book. That's where a lot of I think the most sort of resolved pages and ideas appeared.
And people can see that on the internet, can they? Or?
The book, no, it's out of print now.
Right.
I do have a few there somewhere.
Okay. All right.
But no, it's past its sell-by date now.
Okay. Over here.
I'd like to ask a question that goes a bit beyond the clash of civilizations, straw man, to real cultural differences that people encounter. I mean, presumably you must have gone to places where there were Orthodox Muslim people who believed that representative art was, if not problematic, if not wrong. I mean, I don't know the kind of art that you make, if you're somebody who does representative art or things that are more abstract, but did you get into interesting discussions with people about what art should represent or should not?
Absolutely. And that was one of the greatest myths that was destroyed as I went through the year, the idea that you couldn't make pictures of people when in the Middle East or when around Muslims. That was something I found to be almost entirely untrue. And having read the Quran and spoken to people who've studied the Quran, it's not in the Quran whatsoever. There's several hadiths which allude to the idea that you shouldn't worship a pagan idol, which is probably fairly similar to what the Bible says, I think. But this idea that representative art is forbidden in the Quran is entirely untrue. The only time that I came across that was, in fact, in Damascus, when I spent time with a British Muslim called Mohammed Ishtiaq from Bradford. And he was there, he was studying in, I can't remember the name of it, but an Islamic school in Damascus. And that was one of the most fascinating encounters was seeing, because we both were new to the region, we both spent a year in the region, but we've come at it from very different perspectives, and we had about 3 hours chatting away about the different things we found, what we found to be different to what we expected. But he was the only person who didn't want to have his portrait made. I wanted to do a drawing of him, but he said that he was really sorry, but he couldn't do it because of, on religious grounds. But I found the level of access I was at. For example, I was with plenty of, well, at least 3 different imams throughout the region who would allow me to draw in mosques, to draw people while they're praying and so on, which to me seems to be the apotheosis of making a picture of a Muslim. So that was not a problem.
Harry?
Henry, I thought the book was absolutely marvellous, and Iran did interest me a great deal. You describe at one point the pressures exerted by the authorities in the university or in the art school among your friends. You describe this performance that's put on, if I remember, everyone wears white, and it's a way of protesting. But could you just so perhaps amplify a bit more? And I also remember the girl who is sort of haunted by this headscarf and calls it her brother or something, or who's sort of tormenting her. But these pressures from the powers that be in Iran today on the artist, could you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. I mean, the girl who called her headscarf him, which is something I made lots of pictures about at the time, she was in Damascus, and that was very much her family. That was the power that be in that case was her family and her brother. But the pressure that people feel in Iran is, I suppose, what's the best way I can illustrate this? I had a conversation only about an hour and a half ago with one of the best artists or curators I met in Iran, a guy called Amir Ali Hashemi, and he's in Tehran now. And I wanted to, before I come here, just talk about what he thought had happened to art in Iran recently. And the only reason I'm bringing this in as a sort of parallel is what he was talking about, how much it can change over the course of 5 years, the political climate. And certainly in terms of art that you can make in Iran now, there is a much more conservative attitude towards what can be exhibited, what can be shown in government institutions, what can be talked about in the press. And the point that so many people in Iran would make, and what Amir Ali was making on the phone just now, is that you never know the boundary. It's never, ever made explicit. And that's what's so, well, you could say fascinating, but he says fascinating, but interesting and confusing. In that you only know the boundary is there when you've crossed it. And so in terms of what you can get away with as a woman wearing a headscarf, it would vacillate from month to month. There'd be a crackdown, and then for 2 months there'd be no crackdown. And when I say a crackdown, I mean on girls who'd wear a headscarf back to about there, who would dye their hair blonde there, and then maybe have a strand coming down. These are all very nuanced, different levels of exhibitionism. And the whole time you're pushing the boundaries, and then suddenly you've gone too far, and you'll get not literally dressing down, but you'll get told off. And then you realize the boundary is slightly shifted, but it's very rarely made explicit. I think it's the best way I can answer that.
Is it a bit like a sort of dissident milieu that you'd have had, say, in the Soviet Union, where you had artists and writers and people sort of pushing, and the authorities would crack down and throw a few in jail, and then they let them? Is that the sort of atmosphere?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. Although maybe Ron suggests that artists in Iran are being regularly thrown in jail.
Right.
It's a much more permissive, artistic arena. The most extreme thing that would happen is you wouldn't get allowed into an exhibition as opposed to thrown in jail.
Right. Yes, please.
I'm just curious, as a Western artist looking at what we'd call the East from Western eyes, how do you think the whole concept of Orientalism and exoticism has been shaped or deconstructed, I guess, because of modern journalism and everything that's gone on in the Middle East?
How long have you got? That's a lovely question, and there's so much to talk about there. I'm trying to work out the best way to come at it. First thing that I should talk about is a book I read, I've been reading the last 2 weeks, called For Lust of Knowing by Robert Owen, which is a really full-on assault on Said's whole idea of Orientalism as being pejorative, as being a power structure that every artist who's made art about the Middle East is, whether he likes it or she likes it or not, locked within. And there are parts of that that I'm really taken by. It was something that I thought about not quite every day, but a lot during the year, whether I could truly escape that mantle of being an Orientalist. And by the end of it, I think if I could go back, the art I'd make would be quite different as a result of what I think about it now. I think it is possible to do it, but I think you can only make art in the Middle East, which is free from slurs of Orientalism, if you do so entirely aware of your identity. And I imagine also if you begin to blur your identity, if you collaborate with someone from within the region, then it throws so many of the criticisms that would otherwise be railed at you. It throws them on their head. And so I think my understanding of that, of Orientalism, is changing every day still. And it's different now to what it was a couple of years ago. But I think it is possible to make work that sidesteps Orientalism, definitely, as a Westerner.
Well, would you go back and I mean, it sounds like you're quite curious to see what sort of art you would produce if you went back now, or are you done with it?
I'd like to in a while, not for the moment. I'd to give it a pause in my head. But no, I'd love to go back at one point. So I think I'd have a better perspective now than when I began, and that was a large part of the journey. I wanted to go into it not knowing all of the discourses, all of the narratives, but not knowing Orientalism inside out.
I was just wondering how this kind of objectivism that you were trying to achieve manifested itself in your work. I don't know your work at all, so...
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was trying to be objective at all. I was really trying to be subjective. I was trying to be more and more subjective as the year went on. So, and that's not something I ever aspired to. I think it'd be a mistake to aspire to it as well. But maybe just to broaden out on the question you were asking a moment ago about work that could be made, work that I'm much more drawn to. I was really taken by, there's something called the Arab Image Foundation, which is based in Beirut. And this is an archive of photographs, mostly taken by Lebanese people that several people are trying to collect. And the director of this foundation recently made a distinction, talking about what they wanted to illustrate, what their reason for existing was. And she talked about a distinction between classical Arabic and colloquial Arabic, about Fusar and Amiya, and about how the news, politics, clash of civilizations, talk, Orientalism, is the kind of thing that would always be talked about in classical Arabic. And yet, if you want to talk about gossip or love or slanderous things, you'd talk in colloquial. And she was saying these photographs are very much trying to flesh out this colloquial, the alternative histories, that's what she called it. And that's something that I think best summed up what, by the end of the year, I was trying to do, and what if I went back I would try and do. It's trying to tell alternative histories, the colloquial ones, and trying, in a way, to steer clear of the political hot potatoes.
Because actually the politics, although amplified in our view, is often, for ordinary people you meet in the Arab world, of total irrelevance to their lives.
And just boring as well.
It's boring.
Yeah. And frustrating because there's even less that you can do as someone living in, to stereotype a lot of states in the region, a dictatorship. Yeah.
I mean, I was found in Iran that the same person who would be marching saying death to America, death, if you stopped and spoke to him, you'd say, oh, you're from England, my brother lives in Manchester. You'd have a perfectly nice conversation, he'd take you home and give you dinner. You know, that was a far more authentic version than the on-parade demonstration done for the television cameras to make some point that the leader wanted to make.
Or one of the least reported marches in history, which was one that took place on September the 12th, I think it was, a spontaneous march in sympathy in Tehran for the victims of 9/11. It was reported by very, very, very few people.
Yes, that is interesting, yeah.
Just to back up what Henry said about his art book, I'm lucky enough to own one, and for those who can grab one, It's one of the most beautiful art books I own, so it's really a lovely, lovely piece of work. But that was the path. The question is just really rolling on from all the things you've said, talking about the freedom of art that you were able to push through in the various countries, and following on from what Rick said about people saying death to America and then saying, can I talk to you about my cousin in Manchester? So the freedom that you got and that line that you said you wouldn't know whether you crossed it until you crossed it, do you have a sense now in this country, I imagine you've been amongst Islamic art groups here a bit,
A little.
the censure in this country, or rather the censure of Islamic organisations outside Islamic countries, is far more extreme than it is in the countries themselves?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it has a lot to do with the psychology of what happens when you leave a country. It's been written about a lot by people more learned than me, but when you leave a country, the parts of that country which you never thought you liked become important. The number of women, for example, who will adopt the veil on leaving a Middle Eastern country. Well, not sort of the moment they leave, but upon arrival in a European country will begin to miss that part of what they didn't realize was an element of their identity, but becomes one by negation. And I think it's a very, very similar thing when you're talking about groups of Muslims living in, for example, Britain. The few artistic Muslim groups I can think of living in Britain make a very different kind of art to people in the Middle East, and there's almost a disconnect, I think, between the two. And by this I mean people who really set themselves out to make Islamic art, as opposed to people who are making paintings who happen to be Iraqi and living in London.
You curtailed your book slightly at the end when you arrive in Israel. I was just curious to find out what you made of that, as somebody who's, I think you were grilled for 12 hours by the police who didn't believe your story that you were just driving around painting pictures, and told you that there was no sense of humour in Israel. I'm paraphrasing. But how were you treated there after your experiences elsewhere?
It was like being back in Europe. We were treated well. It did feel very different to being in Syria or Lebanon or Jordan or Egypt, and certainly Iran. But perhaps the most interesting thing that happened there, which didn't make it into the book because I wanted to end it there, was spending time with the guy who runs the Jerusalem Print Center, a man called Arik Kilemnik. And I spent the best part of a day with him, driving around, looking at the wall, and he's a very liberal Israeli, but he was talking about an exhibition he'd curated very recently. And it had got together 48 artists from Palestine and Israel. And it was the largest exhibition of its type ever, I think. And not a single newspaper in Israel or Palestine would touch it, nor a single radio station, and I don't think it appeared on any blogs or on the internet. But they had people from Japan, from Ireland, from Brazil, and so on, interested in it. And when I met him, he was feeling pretty gloomy and philosophical about this. Right. And this is maybe something we need to talk about, but the ability of art to have any political effect when a conflict or a sensibility is so ingrained as he was suggesting it was where he was operating. And he was really open and frank about the fact that although he's an artist, he thought art could do almost nothing to change a political situation in the area he was working.
Which used not to be the case. I mean, I would say 100 years ago, people were far more curious about Islamic art and Arab customs, and it was quite exotic. It didn't have any of the negative characteristics that it now has. I would have thought this type of conversation we're having today would probably be much more frequent 100 years ago, despite the fact we have immediate travel. We're having to live with the legacy of 9/11 and the war.
Which is a huge legacy. That was another interesting thing about being in Israel was being able to see the one image that I'd seen again and again throughout the Middle East. It's not something I mentioned, but that was of the Manhattan skyline, except being used for a very different purpose. And it was the same image because it had. What was so funny about it was that it had a beach that had been photoshopped in to the bottom left-hand corner with a parasol and 2 deck chairs. And it was a glorious image, the Manhattan skyline with the Twin Towers in the absolute heart of it, the sun shining and so on. And I'd kept on seeing this during the year that preceded. And when I saw it in Israel, it was there as a commemoration, but every time I'd seen it in the Middle East, it was in the Arab Middle East and the Iranian Middle East, it was there because it hadn't been taken down. I'd always ask the person there, why is it there? They said, well, we didn't take it down after 2001. And it was there as a vision of paradise, of an exotic other, of a place to escape to. And seeing that was fascinating, because you began to understand how striking down the center of this icon of exotic paradise, earthly paradise, of a place to escape to, striking down the very center of it takes on an entirely different meaning. Well, not entirely different, but I began to understand the visual nature of 9/11, which I really hadn't understood before, and I think it's something that's very, very important when you're considering that event.
Hello, Mr. Hemming. Yeah, you actually know me by
Hello,
before.
Mr.
It sounds not so much like art can't affect situations positively. It sounds more like, you know, given the 9/11, well, the 9/11 sympathy march in Tehran wasn't reported, and also this exhibition, it seems almost like there's some kind of media disinterest in good news stories. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't agree with it, but I'd suggest there are certain narratives that all of us on an almost unconscious level want or need to hear from the Middle East. And I think that's a long, slow process throughout the course of growing up and reading books, reading newspapers, watching TV. And you get to a stage where there are certain things that you want to be confirmed about the Middle East. And I'm talking as much about people who put together newspapers or internet sites as the people who consume it. So I don't think it's just in that sort of killjoy sense not wanting good news, but being accustomed to this this constant stream of strife, I suppose. The idea of the Middle East as an incessant war zone. I think that's what fuels it much more. It's Fred Halliday talks about it really well. He talks about the particularism with which people come at the Middle East. It's the idea that of all the different regions in the world, this one place somehow exists beyond Western rational analysis. That we could analyze what happens in South America or Africa or Asia, but for some reason the Middle East has its own set of rules. And I think that often is the governing principle on a sort of underlying level in terms of what news stories we get to see.
Which wasn't your experience at all? That they somehow inhabit a different world from us?
It wasn't, no.
No. Was there another gentleman? Yes. Yeah.
Hello. I'd like to ask a question about what's going on with art within the Middle East, because you perhaps wrote a book called Off Screen, helping us understand a side of the Middle East that's not reported in the media, but arguably a bigger conflict than Israel or America versus Islam is Islam against itself. Moderate Muslims against Al-Qaeda, for example. How's that getting played out in the art world within the Middle East?
It's the most boring answer I can give, but it is really different from country to country. And I hope that doesn't sound as I'm retreating from that question. But it is so completely different. The art scene, if you like, in Istanbul as compared to Dubai, as compared to Riyadh. And I could give you a sort of incomplete, maybe, lecture on different art scenes in different countries in the Middle East, but I just can't, I'm not able to generalize on that level, because I don't think it is something which meets generalization. I don't think it is a case of Islam fighting the artists and there to be a sort of a sentence-long conclusion about it. So with all the respect, I can't answer that short of telling you about every individual country and what I know of that.
Please.
Henry, I don't know how good your Farsi or your Arabic is, but I assume not good enough to have very deep conversations. So were the people you were talking to some extent self-selecting in that they could speak English to you?
Absolutely. And I hope that's something I really acknowledge. What happens in my book is absolutely not a portrait of the Middle East. It's a portrait of the people who I spoke to and the people who I spent time with. So in terms of people I had long conversations with, yes, of course, they were often both young, male artists and people who could speak English. So they were probably ambitious in that sense, and quite often they were liberal-minded, and I'm the first to admit that. But the one other thing I'd talk about is that when, and this is something I didn't understand before I began the journey, but an awful lot of what I picked up and experienced and have tried to write about is what comes across in non-verbal exchange. So, for example, the time I can remember spending, when I spent several days in a small village outside Isfahan with really limited Persian, with people who spoke even less English. And being able to spend 8 hours in a room with 5 other guys, just making portraits of other people. There's, I think it's still possible to have some kind of dialogue. Of course it's not meaningful dialogue, but you're still able to get an understanding and feel an understanding of something about the people you're with. So I don't think it's right to say you can only understand someone if you can talk to them in English. But otherwise, I fully acknowledge that I didn't speak enough.
There's that one case I think you mentioned, which was very resonant with me, the Christian that you met in Damascus,
yeah.
who, because you were a foreigner, was saying, "Oh, bloody Muslims, aren't they?" Yeah. And then he invites you around, and turns out all his friends are Muslims, and there's absolutely no difference between. But that's, I think that you captured that quite well. If that was your intention.
Definitely.
Somebody in the back. It's being recorded, I'm afraid.
Can I sneak in 2 questions? The first one is maybe quite simple, maybe a yes or no, Henry. Do you have any idea what's happened to the art scene in Iraq since you've been there? Has the conflict, civil war encouraged more of it, or are there just no patrons, so has it died? And the other one is also, it strikes me that you're out of this country and in the Middle East at probably what was quite a formative time for a lot of us who were here in the build-up to the war in Iraq. Everybody had an opinion on it, we learned lots about it. And I'm wondering, when you returned here, did you find that your thinking had diverged a lot from perhaps where others were here, because you've been amongst, well, you've been in the Middle East, you've been experiencing it from a very different point of view. You know, did you find there was a large gulf, as it were, between you and others here?
Yeah, I mean, the first question, yes, I do have a vague understanding of what the Baghdad art scene is doing now, and it's not as easy to make or to exhibit work as it was in the days of Saddam. Is what I understand from my main source on this is a guy who's recently emigrated to America, and what he said emphatically is that a lot of the artists he knows are desperate to get out in order to make work, and so, for example, he knew people who were trying to get jobs as translators in order to improve their chances of getting a visa to America or to England. So the answer is it's not doing as well as it was. That said, it is still alive. There's something really worth Googling. If you Google Baghdad wall painting, you can see extraordinary murals that went up only a few days ago, actually, onto the large concrete blocks that delineate parts of Baghdad. There's some really stunning paintings, which just reminds you how many unemployed and incredibly talented artists there are, who all on interviews say we're desperate for the money. We don't mind the risk of being shot at or being blown up. Then on to the second question. Yes, I did feel a difference, I suppose, of course I did. The thing which was hardest to work against really was the way people would read the paintings that we made and the paintings that we exhibited. And it was only really when I got back that I began to understand much, much more about what people expect to see when they go to an exhibition of paintings from the Middle East. And it's something I had an inkling of before I set out, but most people would either like to see a collection of Orientalist paintings which are safe in their antique and very sort of distant, soft-focus sensibility, or they want to see something which is about Guantanamo Bay, and they want to see 100 different drawings of someone who's reproduced images from the internet of Guantanamo Bay. But to try and make something that squarely sits in between those two was really problematic. And I suppose the best way I can describe this is the editor of a New York magazine called The Village Voice. And this was when, it's about a year and a half after I got back from the Middle East, and I was in New York trying to publicize the book that I had out, but also, this is the book of pictures, but also an exhibition. And I remember I'd sent him a copy of the book. I thought I had a contact to him, and I kept on ringing and ringing and ringing, and he never got back to me. And then finally he did, and he said, look, I'm really sorry, I can't do this. It doesn't fit into anything I know about the Middle East. If this related to some established way of thinking about the Middle East that we all knew, fine. It doesn't, and my readers don't know what to do with it, so I can't cover it. It was that attitude that was, it was difficult. It was problematic.
Which explains possibly why, the war in Iraq was so misguided, and even I think now possibly why some of the remedies people are suggesting are also misguided. People are unable to put themselves in the shoes of the people that you met on your travels. It's quite a difficult thing to do, to imagine what the dynamic of life is like in the Middle East.
It's difficult. I don't envy anyone trying to do that. I know I couldn't adequately do it.
Yes, Marina.
I obviously read the book, because I organised the event, but there are a couple of interesting stories you tell, and I just wanted to ask you, what was your sort of lowest point during the journey, and what was the best? Several. And what was the weirdest one? Funniest one?
Wow. The funniest one, maybe being in Iran, trying to get into someone's ski chalet, and them losing the key, and seeing in the snow a great big star-shaped shape of a man who just fallen into the snow from when the guy the night before had tried to climb through the window drunk. And sort of beginning to try and work out what the shape was, and then realizing it was perfect. Man, he'd fallen through 8 foot of snow before clambering into this amazing getaway. There he was with his CD of train-spotting music and his picture that his aunt had sewn of a Sophia Loren figure that was semi-naked on the wall, and him trying to flesh out a sort of an Iran that you'd never think would exist. That was fun. The lowest moment was during the war, was being in that village and feeling really contagious depression from everyone who was around me, including myself, and that whole thing.
It was in Jordan.
Yeah, fed off each other, I think. And also being really aware of the possibility that I was not wanted there, that trying to work out every day whether I was imposing on the person whose house I was staying in. That was the thing that worried me a lot, and that was difficult. And the highest moment, I don't know if that can go alongside the funniest moment. The highest moment was the end of the exhibition in Amman. Was feeling that we'd put together a body of work that in some way got close to what we were trying to do, that we'd spent 9 months tearing our hair out over and having all these endless discussions in a slightly caricature, earnest young artist way. And we'd finally made something which lots of people responded to, and that felt fantastic, really did. And what was the other one? Ooh, I should have thought of this before I came here. Can I refer to maybe walking into one of the parties in Tehran, which felt like walking into a really glamorous Shishi New York party. That was weird, very weird.
But you were still, as a British artist, you were still welcomed almost wherever you went. I mean, you didn't have apart from that one instance when you said the bourgeois kids having a cup of coffee sort of swore at you, but apart from that, you were waved into town. I often wonder what would happen to Iranian artists if they showed up at Dover in a beaten-up car and said, "Oh, we're here to drive around England," and it's worth thinking about. I mean, I don't think we'd give them anything like as generous a welcome, actually.
Well, we certainly wouldn't.
I don't think they'd make it in.
No, I'm aware of that from making art outside, and more than a few people brought that up.
Yeah.
Would I get the same response if I went to England? Do you think I should go to England? No.
Are there any more questions? Tash, you had a question?
Another question, linked a little bit to the Orientalism question, is did you find you had to guard against the sort of seductiveness that might be entailed in being, well, being a man in a place where there are certain privileges that come with that? I mean, generations of sort of upper-class English people have gone out to the Middle East and men and adored it because it's a bit like being in boarding school, you know, getting an all-male environment and it wonderful and everyone's like, and that combined with the fact that you're sort of in a world of the world that appreciates art generally is a sort of elite world too. And did you have to sort of really, did you find you have to sort of make an effort to look behind that, to see the world in the kitchens, behind it, the women who are behind, and the veiled world in a sense that exists at the same time as the sort of seductive world you describe, sitting, you know, with 5 men in a room, drawing them. You know, what about the sisters and the daughters and mothers?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a big non-stop frat party or sort of attention. But you're right in that there's certainly an element of that, and especially when you're outdoors, because the outdoors in so many different countries I went to in the Middle East was a male arena, and I know I'd have had an entirely different time had I been there as a woman. But I mean, for example, the 5 men I was talking about sitting around it, these were farmers, peasants. They were not artists whatsoever. And I'm completely aware of that, and that's why I'd hate to, so I try very hard not to go to a place and just operate out of a studio. That's why every day I was sitting outside. And I suppose the other thing which I should probably mention as a sort of a weakness is you do, as well as attracting people who just want to come and watch, you're always going to attract extroverts. Because if you're sitting down, you're entirely stationary, you can't go anywhere. And so in a way, you're captive to whoever comes and sits down next to you, and whatever they want to say to you, and however long they want to be with you, or what have you. So that I'm more worried about that, about the idea that the people we were most often spending time with were the people who would go out of the way to come and talk to us, I think.
You were joined by a woman artist, though, weren't you? George,
yes.
Is it? Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, it wasn't an entirely male scene for.
And also, the art scene in Tehran is not all male at all. There are many more women in art colleges in Iran than there are men. But no, in other countries it was dominated by men.
Right.
So.
Hi, sorry, this isn't a question. I just wanted to say I am Iraqi, but I've been in England a long time. I recently went to Jordan. A lot of the good Iraqi artists have actually found themselves in Jordan because it's the country that lets them in. A lot of them are actually now refugees, and the Jordanians have gotten so many Iraqi refugees now that they're not actually renewing their visas. So a lot of the artists are selling their work basically just to survive right now. A lot of the Iraqis as well, the famous Iraqi artists still have that status, and within the Middle East they're doing very, very well. So I just wanted to add that point. Another point I wanted to add is that Iraq is a very mixed country that contains Christians, Muslims, Jews, and it's one of the most liberal countries in the Middle East. So I don't know, there are lots of stereotypes happening, but very few are actually extreme. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I can concur entirely with everything you've said, and many Iraqi artists who are working in Jordan. And in fact, the gallery where we worked, the mother of the woman who ran it was Iraqi, and I think about half of the artists on her list were Iraqi expats or exiles. So I became very aware of the art scene there. And it was really through talking to the people there that I realized I wanted to go to Baghdad so much, because they are the people who, and I'm talking about the Iraqi artists working in Amman, who would talk about Baghdad as being the artistic capital of the Middle East as much as anyone else. And they were the people who also would go back quite often and come back with reports on how everything was going in terms of the art world, in terms of the artists they knew. So, yes, I agree with, but as you said, it's not a question.
Harry? We'll come back to that.
One last question about art. To whom did you, as an artist, feel closest? I mean, in terms of their art, was it particular individuals in Iran or in Iraq or indeed anywhere? I'm trying to get a feel of, in your terms, how contemporary was contemporary art in the countries you went to,
Sure.
or not? I know it's an impossibly broad question, but...
No, it's great. It's the country I felt most affinity for was Iran, as with so many other things. And I suppose one of the best examples of how contemporary, and for a lot of people this equals up its own arse, but how contemporary the art in Iran, for one person at least, was. I thought it was a fantastic piece, but I know a lot of people might not. By this man called Amir Ali, which involved an exhibition of the leading lights in the contemporary Iranian art scene, which went on just about 2 weeks before we arrived in Iran. And it was a group show, it was about 30 people. And Amir Ali had not been invited. He was on the margins. He felt he should have been. And what happened was he went along to the private view of the exhibition and produced from his pocket and held out on his hand a bell, kind of bell that you ping when you go to a small hotel. And there were two bouncers, people checking names, and he held it out and just went, and they let him in because they assumed that he was a performance artist. And so he walked around the room, and this is the equivalent of going into the most rarefied white cube opening, which no one might be allowed into, and went up to the equivalent of J. Joplin and so on, and would hold out his bell without saying a word. And eventually people began to realize that they were to ring it. And so he went around, and by the end of it he had about 20 people following him, and everyone rang it slightly differently. Some people were too busy sipping at their drink or talking to someone, or I would scuff it. And of course, to ring something like that well, you have to be very, very careful. You have to bang it in just the right way. And people would, the crowd that was following him by this stage was sort of applauding if someone did it well, or booing if they did it badly. And so he walked around like this, entirely silent, but for his bell. And then after half an hour, walked out. And then in the reviews of the exhibition, they said the person who stole the show was the performance artist, whose name no one knows. And that was brilliant, because as he said, I want to announce my arrival without saying a word. And he did it.
Very good. There was somebody over here?
It was actually going to be... Sorry, apologies for my voice as well. It was actually going to be something more like a comment as well, because basically the thing that keeps kind of reverberating in my head is that you made a comment on how media are representing, what's happening in the Middle East at the moment towards here, and was this not a climate for like happy stories or anything? I'm just wondering in how far it's actually representing the fact that the government needs us to see a particular side so they have the backing for their mission rather than anything else. And I don't know, it's maybe kind of cynical, but I think it needed to be said.
I think Richard can ask that question better. Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean the British government and British media?
Western, just yeah. I know that people always think that we're being dictated to and producing, but car bomb goes off and kills 60 people. I'm not doing my job if I don't report it. I was in Baghdad recently. I really did try to write other things. Everywhere I looked was death and misery, and it's hard to look beyond it. If there had been an art exhibition, I'm sure we would have all been happy to report it. But the fact of the matter is it's a very desperate situation. More broadly, though, I think you're right. I think we do have a fairly one-dimensional view of the Middle East, and that is the coverage. I was also a correspondent in Russia, where people were interested in what happened to Tolstoy's estates and what's happening to the ecology of Siberia. There was a broader interest in the culture of the society, which there doesn't seem to be in the case of the Arab world and the Middle East in general, which is a shame, because once you don't understand societies, that's when you have situations like this arising. But I don't think you can blame the media entirely. It's also the responsibility of the public. You know, people are not terribly interested in it, and people sell newspapers to people who want to buy them. So it's a sort of chicken and egg situation, and I think what we've heard this evening from Henry is that we would all do better to spend maybe a bit more time, you know, learning about places and actually visiting them. And it's very easy to go to Iran, as we've heard, and have an extraordinary time. And you know, maybe instead of spending a week on a beach, we should think about visiting the galleries of Tehran. Well, thank you very much indeed. If there's any more questions, we're happy to take them, but thank you very much for coming.